I think of a fit for purpose organizational structure as allowing you to really design your company's operating system. And of course, the needs of that operating system change very much over time, but without a good operating system, there aren't clearly defined roles and responsibilities, which impedes effective decision making.
Hello and welcome to the Emerge Product Market Fit Academy series, where we're joined by leading operators and founders in edtech to share practical insights and advice for early stage founders. If you're building the future of learning and work, then this is for you. I'm Zara, recording this episode from sunny Dubai, and today I'm joined by our guest and venture partner, Lucy Stonehill, founder of BridgeU. In 2015, Lucy founded BridgeU, the leading university and careers guidance provider connecting international K-12 schools and students in over 140 countries to higher education institutions globally. In 2020, BridgeU was acquired by Kaplan, one of the world's largest, most diverse education providers. Over the course of her career, Lucy has raised over $50 million from institutional and strategic investors, and I am super excited to dive into all the learning she's picked up on this journey. Hi, Lucy. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, Zara. Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Our conversation today will focus on organizational design and team management. We'll cover what org design actually is and why it's important, when to shift from founder-led sales to building out a sales team, how to manage a senior leadership team, and how to manage personal productivity and accountability as a leader. But before we jump into discussing all these topics, I would love to get a quick overview of your journey building BridgeU. It's been almost 10 years now. I would love for you to take us back to year one, through the different stages, up to the acquisition by Kaplan, and then where you are today.
Thanks so much, Zara. Yes, the 10-year anniversary is around the corner, so I've been reflecting a lot on the various stages. And I think is always the case with startups, every sort of couple of years has really felt quite different. Something that has remained very consistent, though, is our mission. BridgeU exists to connect talent with opportunity globally. But I think how we address that mission and how we manifest that mission and for which stakeholders has certainly changed quite significantly over the last 10 years. I think like a lot of founders, I really resonated with the problem space that I got increasingly more intrigued by. So BridgeU fundamentally is in the business of trying to build better university and careers guidance programs and solutions for secondary schools. And I myself, of course, was a student who went through that process at some point. So, initially, I think I was really kind of quite fascinated by the problem and how poorly that problem was being solved within schools, at the point at which I started BridgeU. And so the first couple of years, really with a very small team around me, I think we really set out, our primary objective was really to sort of deepen our knowledge around the kind of component parts of that problem. Why is it challenging for students to think about how to transition between stages of education, in this case, secondary and higher education? Why do schools struggle to manage this process effectively? And so we kind of broke down all the component parts and really set about building an early solution that we could bring to test and validate with customers. I think, the other thing, of course, beyond thinking about the problem, the core problem and the solution, the other thing that very early stage teams are obviously challenged with is how you might start to test and validate that someone, somewhere, somehow will be willing to pay for what you're creating. And so we did a lot of early business model testing. We sort of trialed B2C, and then we also trialed B2B, meaning visiting schools, meeting with the right stakeholders within those schools, teachers and faculty members who had responsibility for the careers guidance process, and that really quite quickly became it became clear to us, I think, quite quickly that was the right avenue. Immediately, even just talking about the idea, let alone the solution, we saw a lot of interest on the part of secondary school leaders to provide them with better tooling and infrastructure to manage the guidance process. So, those first couple of years are very creative, right? And they're really focused in on kind of building the basics of a solution that nails some of the core pain points around the problem you're solving, and then starting to try and build up proof that someone will pay for what you've built and that you can implement that program or that product effectively. So we were really quite lasered in on the secondary school space, and even more specific than that, we picked a segment of the secondary school market, global and international schools, because what we realized, and I guess this sort of comes a little bit back to the sort of founding inspiration behind BridgeU, is that access to higher education, access to quality higher education globally is extremely unequal. I think something like 70% of the top 1,000 globally ranked universities are in 4 countries. So, it's an example of huge inequity and inaccessibility to access globally. And you have a lot of secondary schools, particularly in emerging markets, who are explicitly trying to support students with considering global opportunities for higher education. So we narrowed in very specifically on that niche and started to build up, 1 school, 2 schools, 5 schools. And over time we got, we learned a lot, of course, in those early couple of years, and got to a point where the traction was starting to feel meaningful, meaning we had sort of started to feel that we were approaching product market fit. And that's, I guess, the point at which we started to look to scale up that part of the operation. So to bring in more salespeople, to expand the product and engineering team. And that kind of, so that's around when we raised our Series A as well. That sort of funded the expansion across the core functions and teams that we had at BridgeU. But it also, for us, what was very important was global expansion, because we were serving a very international market, a niche of secondary schools within every country, in effect. So that sort of startup to sort of beginning to scale up phase also funded our expansion of our kind of global office space and our global teams. That stage obviously then continued for a few years. And we got to a point where we felt very confident that we really had a strong formula in place for acquiring high schools, for supporting them, for renewing them, for innovating, continuing to innovate on the core kind of product space that we occupied. And that was really when universities started to come into the picture. And I probably was the one who sort of led a little bit of an experiment into that space, and brought on board a handful of early university innovators to say to them, we have this fantastic community, global community of students and counselors and advisors all over the world. The types of schools that we work with are unique insofar as they have a global orientation, both at the curricular level, but also in part because that's the orientation of where students tend to progress to higher education. And sort of working very closely, I guess, in a very innovative way with these universities to say, how would you want to interact with this community of students? Because, of course, the universities themselves also have a very clear vested interest in attracting the best possible student talent from across the world. So that was sort of in 2018, 2019, when we started to explore a really different customer and stakeholder group altogether. And that coincided with a period of time when we were approached by a couple of different organizations that were larger, more strategic, who had, in many cases, fantastic existing mature networks of university partners. And one of those, of course, was Kaplan. And Kaplan, came to us. We discussed what capabilities, what user groups, what communities we had, looked at the same on their end, and really felt that actually a fantastic way for BridgeU to scale would be within the context of this larger organization. So we teamed up with Kaplan at that point, and that was around 2020. And it's been a really kind of interesting 4 years since, almost to the day, where we've had an opportunity, particularly with Kaplan's much greater sort of knowledge and expertise around university admissions and student recruitment, to really accelerate that next phase of the company. So we continue very much to invest in our global community of K-12 international schools, students, advisors, and parents. But the new part of our business has really been oriented around how do we how do we create an ecosystem, a guidance ecosystem where universities can be important stakeholders in that wider community.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Lucy. It was almost like a crash course in PMF right there, from really understanding the problem, the testing hypotheses, and nailing down a proven formula before you built out that team, right up until acquisition as well. But very excited to dig into the lessons you've taken from that journey. Let's start with the first topic. So org design is not necessarily something that founders think about actively at the early stage. Can you chat to us a little bit about what organizational design actually is and why it's important to think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Very gladly, Zara. And I certainly didn't think about org design in the very early stages of BridgeU. I think, broadly speaking, let's define it. So org design refers to the process of structuring an organization to achieve that organization's goals and objectives most effectively. So it can involve everything from designing systems, structures, teams, dividing up roles and responsibilities to best align the company's strategy and objectives at that particular stage in time with the right organizational framework to facilitate those goals and those objectives.
So it's like resource allocation, but the resource here is people.
Correct. I think mostly people. I mean, as you scale up, of course, you get more into kind of systems and processes and how do you create the glue between the people to ensure that they can communicate and operate effectively. But no, that's absolutely right. And I think, I mean, the second question, I mean, this is very important. I think I've become more and more a believer that very intentional organizational design over time is a really key part of what helps these organizations grow and ultimately succeed. And I think the reason that it's so important is I kind of think of a fit for purpose organizational structure as allowing you to really design your company's operating system. And of course, the needs of that operating system change very much over time, but without a good operating system, there aren't clearly defined roles and responsibilities, which impedes effective decision making. Without intentional, structured organizational design, you'll struggle to delegate and empower individuals to be responsible and accountable for certain key projects and initiatives. So good org design also allows you to set up the rules of engagement within your startup. And again, without good organizational design, you certainly won't be able to utilize your resources, mainly people, most effectively, and that in turn will become a challenge when you're ready for scale.
I love that frame of org design being a tool to really help accelerate your path to achieving your mission and vision and getting all of your team on the same page so everyone kind of knows what they're doing at all times. Can you talk us through the general stages that startups go through when it comes to org design?
Yeah, absolutely. At the beginning, most startups, rightly so, have a very little structure to their organization. Most companies at the very early stages implement pretty horizontal organizational structure. So this, feels a bit like a collection of passionate individuals bonded tightly together. Often, it used to be back in the day before remote working, we used to be in one room, one space, and you're really kind of working together collectively to solve, typically a single hard problem. I think whilst the division of roles is clear, I think the responsibilities are very shared. And there's a sentiment that, you're very much in this together. Then, as I mentioned, once we started to get some sort of traction and we got our first sort of 20, 30, 40 high schools, we started to add people and you feel like you're progressing towards achieving product market fit. And, at that point, startups typically start to evolve into team-based organizations where teams emerge and those teams exist to serve very particular goals or functions. So at BridgeU, the first two kind of functional teams we assembled were the schools commercial team, very creatively named, which included both the business development managers as well as the account managers serving and supporting our high school clients. And then you had the tech team, which back then was loosely defined as probably a product manager, a designer, and a collection of engineers. I think then over time, as you start to grow more, and I think this is growth in both headcount, but also really maturity of the startup, your functional teams also expand, and you'll evolve to start to require a management layer and a bit more structure, which tends to result in the emergence of what's known as a circular organizational design. one starts to build a bit of a hierarchy, and sometimes that's when you see the emergence of a dedicated management team or a leadership team that then start to assume responsibility for, company-wide executive decisions, strategy, and resource allocation more broadly. And then I guess I have experience, particularly in the last few years, being part of a much bigger company where, and this is I think true also of much bigger startups or scale ups, those that have sort of many hundreds of people. You can start to see the emergence of a sort of matrix structure where you have that circular organizational design, but even more than that, you also have divisional structures or specific teams or squads or business units that are focused in on dedicated projects or product lines or even regional offices. So we have offices in a multitude of different countries, and whilst there's a collection of individuals, for instance, within our Hong Kong office that actually have different management structures, but they serve as a matrix function as our Hong Kong office. So I think, I've experienced this over the last 4 years in particular, as BridgeU's been part of Kaplan. We now operate under the umbrella of this, much bigger education company, and we ourselves now would be considered a business unit of Kaplan.
Thanks, Lucy. Super helpful to kind of hear that transition from very early days where you, as you said, have this collection of very committed individuals moving towards the same goal to starting to, I guess, org design becomes more and more important as you bring in new team members to really ensure everyone knows how everything fits together. What are the key mistakes that you've seen founders make at the early stage with org design?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's inevitable that you won't get org design right all of the time. I sort of think if you're getting it right 80% of the time, you're probably doing a lot better than most. I think reflecting on my own journey, there are a few mistakes that I've made, sometimes more than once, if I'm being honest, that are easy traps that founders can fall into. So just to highlight a few of them, one of them, which I'm sure you've seen as well, Zara, across the Emerge portfolio, is hiring too senior too early, and I suppose being seduced by the perception or the promise of experience. I really think in the early stages of a startup's life, I think you need people who operate like Swiss Army knives. So they're highly versatile. They have a variety of tools that they can leverage to really figure things out. And that type of individual is often very broad in their skill set, but not particularly deep. Whereas actually quite experienced or senior leaders, by comparison, they tend to be very deep, functional experts, but often not that broad. So to me, it's a little bit of a trade-off between breadth and depth. And I do think this really starts to change and evolve as the company's requirements for the trade-off between that breadth and depth of skill sets starts to change as well. I think the second mistake, which I think is a very human mistake to make, is really holding on to people for too long, out of loyalty or because you like the person. I think this is particularly hard for early stage founders. You have such a committed group of individuals in the early stages who are often, working, beyond reasonable hours, who are typically taking a pay cut to go on this journey with you. And so there's a lot of, that's a very kind of bonding experience. But I've also realized that the organization's needs do change significantly, particularly every sort of 2 to 3 years of the company's life cycle. And I've also realized that actually, if you realize as a founder that there's been someone who's been part of your organization for the last couple of years and they've been fantastic in that context, and they're not right to scale with you, then it's really the kind thing to let them go as soon as you become aware of that fact. And so that's, I think this is where, you start to kind of challenge sometimes the emotional connections that people build in the early days. But I fundamentally think it doesn't serve the individual, nor does it serve the organization to hold on to people for too long once you realize they're probably not the right profile to support you and the company with the next stage of its evolution. And then I guess the third sort of really challenge I think that I've seen myself a number of times on over the last few years, 10 years really, is what I think of as the right role, right person conundrum. So often when you're hiring for a totally new role. So say your first HR person or your first data scientist, you have the challenge of needing to get two things right at the same time. You're needing to scope out and define really specifically the right role for your organization at that point in its evolution, but you're also then having to you're challenged with the task of finding the right person for the role. And I think, this is a real double whammy because you're having to do two things at once, both of which are kind of new to you. And certainly I think what can often happen in these situations is, if that person or that role doesn't start to sort of manifest the impact that you're expecting, I think it's very hard to figure out if actually you got the wrong scoping for that role. You're perhaps looking for, you scoped out a role that was someone who was perhaps a little bit more managerial, whereas you need someone who's more hands-on. Hard to figure out if actually it's the role definition that's the wrong thing or if it's the individual. So I think those are kind of a collection of different kind of maybe pitfalls that I've often seen. I've certainly fallen into myself, but I often see are easy traps for early stage founders.
Extremely helpful, especially if you are a first-time founder and maybe haven't done it before.
Exactly.
This breadth versus depth, it can be extremely flattering that someone who is very senior and has a lot of experience wants to work with you, and it can seem like an easy yes, especially if they're willing to take a pay cut to join you. But what can that look like in terms of like the long-term impact on your business, and what do you really need right now? And I think the two other points that you mentioned in terms of holding on for people too long and getting the right role, right person balance right, both of those fit into what feels good right now versus what might be most useful for the growth in the sort of medium to long term. So really, really useful. Thanks for sharing that. And kind of taking that one step further, one of the big transitions as you grow your team and you're kind of balancing all of these trade-offs, one of these moves that you have to make is from a very founder central model to building out your functional teams, as you touched on earlier, and being able to delegate. And so I have two questions here. The first one is that, in VC and startups, we always say that it is so important for sales in the early days to be founder led. And my first question is, why is that? And the second question is, when do you shift from founder led sales to building out your sales team?
Yeah, great question, Zara. And I 100% agree. I think it's very important for founders to lead the early sales at an organization. So to your first question, why is that important? I mean, I think it's important because I think it's really important that founders deeply understand the challenges and the pain points of the solutions that they're looking to build. So you only get that if you have hands-on real world exposure and experience to the customers you're looking to collaborate with. I think the second reason it's important is I think founders connect very well with customers who want to be innovators or early adopters. And I think this is because both early adopter buyers and founders do share a little bit of a values overlap. They care about the spirit of change and disruption and evolution. And I think that that can be a really powerful point of leverage in the early sales that and converted clients that you bring on board. So I loved selling to our first kind of 50 or maybe even 100 schools at BridgeU because the counselors, the teachers, the advisors I met then who really bought into BridgeU were really buying into a vision for how guidance counseling could evolve in schools. They were very much co-collaborators on a vision of the future, much more so than they were buyers of a product, based on a checklist of need to have features. This does start to change, though, right? There's only so many early adopters and innovators in the customer pool that you'll be looking to address. So this starts to change, or this started to change at BridgeU, certainly when we started to migrate our focus into the early majority or late majority buyer set. These buyers, they tend to buy after the early adopters and innovators. They tend to have much higher expectations for product hygiene and a much lower risk appetite overall. And so when you start to sell into these slightly more conservative buyers, but there's many more of them than there are early adopters, I think the sell itself starts to lend itself to more of a script with a kind of standardized set of objections to handle and rebuttals, and there's more of a standardized pricing structure with these types of buyers. So from my perspective, that in and of itself lends itself to a more repeatable and scalable sales process. And that, I think, is the right time to then start to look at expanding the team, hiring and training up a sales team that can certainly learn from the founders, but ultimately the type of sell that they'll be performing is certainly very different from the sell that the more concept-based sell that you would be putting to an early adopter or innovator buyer base.
I really love that framing of your early adopters as these co-collaborators and innovators. And I think it just goes to the point that rapid experimentation and that user feedback is so, so important. And I think it's very much tied to this founder-led sales in the early days, because every sales pitch is also an opportunity to really learn from your early adopters and
Yes.
deepen your understanding of what they're looking for, what pain points they have, what challenges they have as well. And very clear on, when you start to be able to standardize that process and the points that come up, how to handle them, and you kind of have this script and more standardized set of points, rebuttals, standardized pricing, that is when you have a more repeatable and scalable process to bring in and kind of build up that sales team. Have you had any strategies or frameworks that you've used that have helped that transition and building out a sales team when you maybe have that process? How do you build a team that can share that energy with you, even when maybe the process is a little bit more standardized?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, honestly, I think a lot of it really comes down to brilliant basics, Zara. So, I mean, with the training, onboarding, and supporting an early kind of small sales team, that there's a lot of brilliant basics. A lot of it comes down to documentation, providing them with the tools they need to be successful. And then I think, coaching, learning by osmosis. In the early days of BridgeU, when we had our first kind of handful of sales reps on the school side, we would do, pitching hours every Friday. So someone would come and they would present and pitch, different parts of the sales pitch. The team would feedback. I, as the leader of that team, would obviously give comments, offer feedback. So I think it is a relatively kind of standardized process, hiring and onboarding effective salespeople in the early days. But I think I still think at that early stage, you do still need people who are, who share some of that passion and who are excited by, what will end up being still a very new company and one where you don't have the benefit of a known brand to rely upon. So I think you do still need a very dynamic, passionate, energized group of individuals, which often end up being, quite younger and less experienced. I think, again, as you start to scale up beyond that, that's when I think you can start to look at investing a little bit more in sort of proven experience. But I'm a big believer in hiring for potential and really shaping and supporting that potential as the needs of your organization change as well.
That's a really great point, that you may have moved past that founder-led sales, but since you don't have an established brand, every person that you bring onto your sales team, even if it is a more standardized script, is still part of that brand building. It's still part of building out how people perceive you as a company through that kind of sales process. Moving more broadly from sales teams to a senior leadership team. As founders build out a senior leadership team for the first time, it's definitely not always easy. You have a lot of people coming from different types of backgrounds, different ways of working, different personalities. What was your experience like when you first built out your senior leadership team at BridgeU? And do you have any frameworks you can share that helped you kind of manage that SLT?
I don't have any specific frameworks that I've used in the past. I'll come into I'll comment in a second on a framework we use today to manage the leadership team and how that sort of cascades into the rest of the organization. But I do have, I guess, a couple of tips or I suppose principles that have actually served me very well in the past, both in sort of initially hiring and assembling a senior leadership team and now actually in running that leadership team. So, I think when I first started hiring senior people, I was, in my mid to late 20s. So I was very young myself. And I think in part because of that, I very much approached these senior members of my team with a lot of humility and respect, respect for their experience, what I could learn from that. And I guess also respect for the fact that, we were really building I wanted to have more of a partnership with those individuals coming into the business. So I use my one-on-ones very intentionally as more brainstorming sessions and opportunities to co-collaborate with those individuals, not as an opportunity to kind of check their homework or micromanage their work. So I think that, that's sort of one piece of advice I would give, particularly to maybe younger founders, about how to actually bring those people on, set them up for success, and treat them as co-collaborators on this journey. I guess that's in the early days, and then fast forward to now, I have a fantastic team of senior functional leaders, and it's been a really exciting but interesting journey for me. Also taking that team from different sort of stages of experience. In the earlier days, of course, we had people who were more those Swiss Army knife managers or leaders who had a broader skill set, and over time we've invested a lot more in that kind of deep functional expertise. And I've used different frameworks, I suppose, for bringing that team together and trying to make sure that team feels like that is their number one team. And I think something that we have experimented with the last few years, and we've sort of rolled it out differently every year, but I think this year we've probably done the best job we have over the last few years, is OKRs. So objectives and key results. Again, we've experimented with lots of different ways of using OKRs, but I think the way we use them today works very well for an experienced senior leadership team. And that is that we collectively use and define OKRs at the company level. We manage and track them at the company level. And that means tracking performance and progress towards those goals. And senior leaders are, of course, responsible for how their teams contribute effectively into those goals. But what we've done is we've left the definition of OKRs at that level. So what that means is we've allowed those senior experienced functional leaders to establish their own methods of managing and tracking their own team's performance. And I think that's really kind of helped strike the balance effectively between respecting the senior leaders will come into your organization. They'll have done things a certain way in the past that in many ways has worked very, very well for them. And so you want to give them the authority and the empowerment to do that. But you also want to make sure that every member of the senior leadership team is coming together and collectively striving towards a set of shared company goals or objectives.
Super helpful. And I'd love to go back and dig a level deeper. As a young first-time founder, how did you go about sourcing your senior leadership team? Because I think for many founders at the early stage, it can be something that's very intimidating. They've got this great product, super excited about it. They've already built out a very early team. But once you start bringing on people that are maybe older than you, have decades more of experience than you, I think it's a very hard thing to navigate. But how did you first source them? And then how did you establish your ways of working with them in the early days?
Reflecting on my first two senior exec hires, one actually came very helpfully through my investor at the time, Octopus Ventures. They recommended a very experienced finance director, and she became really a lot more than that to me. She was very experienced, and she provided me with a lot of coaching, in fact, and kind of much broader support than what a typical finance director would do. So I think she, again, was very drawn to my energy and my passion in the problem space I wanted to solve. But she also was attracted to the idea that I was young, I would need a lot of help. And I think she felt it would be a rewarding experience to provide that to me. And we had a fantastic professional relationship for a number of years. My second very senior hire was after our Series A, we hired a very experienced chief technology officer. In that instance, Zara, I'm not, I studied literature at university. I am not a technical founder, nor necessarily am I, was I exposed to many technical leaders before starting BridgeU. So in that instance, I found a very specialist recruitment firm that was well vetted by a number of my peers, and use them specifically to help me meet, 7, I think maybe 9 or 10 in the end, candidates for the role. And, funnily enough, a lot of it just came down to the human connection. And again, that sort of chemistry that, that compatibility. I think, again, in this case, this individual was, I think, drawn to the same things. He was drawn to the passion, the enthusiasm, my quite keen commercial sense. And I think he felt inspired by the problem we were solving. He spent most of his career in different sort of verticals within technology, but he had a family full of teachers, and I think he was really kind of wanting to do something more within education. So there was also an overlap in terms of interests there. But yeah, as I mentioned, with both of those individuals, when I brought them on board very, very early, I mean, it was around when, well, in one case before we raised our Series A, the other just right when we were closing our Series A. Again, I think I just saw the opportunity to really learn from their experience, and I had no ego about that. So coming back to that the importance of humility, I think that can be very disarming for people, particularly if they've been in much bigger environments where they've perhaps had CEOs who were slightly different in terms of their temperament. I think for me, I always felt that I got more from them because I was sort of humble and sought their opinion in a genuine sense. And treated them as peers and partners on this journey.
Very helpful. So you have on the side of where to actually find people, you mentioned your investor and the specialist recruitment firm. And then in terms of what to actually look for, I think it was really useful advice that find people that recognize, yes, you're young and maybe don't have that much experience, but they see your potential, they're excited about your mission, and they see their role as being able to support you and for you to also learn from them, but in a almost like a partnership. Basically, it's, as you said with your early adopters, find someone that can be your co-collaborator as well. So yeah, very helpful there. Thank you. And my final question is on a more personal level. So as a founder, and I think we've touched on this a little bit in terms of the role of, if you get the right people at that senior level, they can play a little bit of a role on this front. But as a founder, you're dealing with so many competing problems all the time. There's so many demands on your attention. And again, this is a two-pronged question. So firstly, how do you manage your personal productivity and accountability as a leader? And then my second question is, more importantly, how do you stay sane and maintain your mental health as a founder?
Yeah, great questions. There's a lot in there. I guess I'll take the first one first. So, thinking about how I manage my time and schedule, really honestly, Zara, this has changed so dramatically over the last 10 years. I think I've been generally good at adapting my personal habits and schedule to meet the requirements of that stage of the company's evolution. So back in 2016, a year and a half after we started the business, again, I mentioned that from day one, BridgeU was a very global business. We were selling to high schools, in a number of countries from almost the get-go. And we started to realize there was a real pull towards Asia, and I started traveling out there a lot. And in 2016, I put a proposal in front of my investors that would ask them to fund the expansion of our office infrastructure and talent. So to start an office in Hong Kong, and they signed that off, thought it was a good idea, and said, okay, Lucy, get on a plane and off to Hong Kong you go. So I went to Hong Kong for 9 months, hired in that early team, worked odd hours, quite honestly. Obviously I was working, Hong Kong hours in the morning and then European hours in the evening, and often getting on a plane and going to other parts of Asia to visit high schools or to attend conferences and fairs. Then I suppose in 2020, when international admission offices obviously ground to a halt because admission staff could no longer travel to meet prospective applicants or visit schools or attend, again, university fairs, we had quite a unique moment in time opportunity to really sell our kind of digital student recruitment solution into these admissions offices. And so I probably spent 7-8 hours a day on Zoom calls pitching these institutions, because again, it was a moment in time opportunity. This completely out of the blue sort of black swan event had happened, and that really presented a major challenge for these international admissions offices, a challenge that I think we were very well positioned to meet. And then I guess in the last sort of 2.5 years, my day-to-day has changed very significantly again. As I mentioned, we've leveled up the leadership team very significantly in the last couple of years. So, I've been focused a lot more on how I can empower them and enable their success. And so I guess just highlighting a few of these examples for you, I think the common thread is I have, grown and evolved with the company. And, to your second point, what that means is I have, in many occasions, I'd probably say most occasions, been willing to put the company's needs first. That hasn't always meant that has sort of challenged, that's come up against my own needs, but in certain instances it has. And I think that's, part of me on my, sometimes thinks, well, that's what it takes to be a founder. But I also think that can be one of the biggest challenges of being a founder, speaking to some of the points you made around the sort of mental health point. I think, over the years, something that's been a complete sort of saving grace for me has been my peer network of founder CEOs. I'm very lucky to have had fantastic sort of founder peers that have, tracked with me at different stages over the last 10 years. And, the journey is relatively unique, particularly if you are a technology startup with, having raised venture capital or private equity. And so having that sort of intimate, trusted network of founder CEOs who you can lean on, but also who can sort of help you take a step back and gain perspective, I think has been sort of invaluable for my mental health over the last 10 years.
Amazing. And have you found sort of formal mastermind type groups to be particularly helpful, or is this more informal connections with other founders and CEOs?
Yeah, it's both, Zara. So, again, in the early days, my investors were fantastic about introducing me to portfolio founders, a number of whom became close friends. And then sort of in the last 6-7 years, I've been part of a forum. There's about 9 or 10 of us in that forum. We've been together for 7 years now, and that's become this really invaluable kind of connected tissue throughout the ups and downs of what has been for everyone really a very tumultuous 5, 6, 7 years, and knowing that group is there, and that we have these regular touch points, and that we have a level of vulnerability that we can share, which is sometimes hard to share with others, even others who might within close friends or family units. Again, I think for that whole group, for the 9 or 10 of us, I think has been extremely important.
Definitely having people there that perhaps not exactly if you're building different companies, but as close to as possible, understand what you're going through. And especially 7 years, being through all of those stages together is incredibly important. And I think very special to have a bond with people that have seen you through those different stages and have maybe felt some of that themselves. So thank you so much for sharing that. Let's move now into the final part of the session, which is our quick fire round. So I'm going to ask you a quick question and you respond with a one-line response. Are you ready?
Yes.
What is a piece of advice that you received in the early days of building BridgeU that stuck with you ever since?
Listen to your gut and trust your instincts. As odd as it sounds, I mean, I'm a very analytical person, so even saying that out loud sounds sort of odd. But I look back at decisions I made, decisions I didn't make, decisions I delayed. And I think more often than not, I think my instinct was right.
If you weren't in higher education, what would you be doing?
When I was at university, I studied literature, and I thought very seriously about becoming a journalist. Particularly, I was interested in investigative journalism. I've recently read Kara Swisher's Burn book, and was just totally inspired by her story. I think journalists are very brave. I respect the integrity of seeking truth and telling stories that matter. And I think in that sense, I think there is a very kind of common, in some ways, overlap with founders who need to be brave and need to put themselves on the line in order to take a big risk. So I think there's some commonality there, but I think I'd be a journalist.
What is a common piece of startup advice that you disagree with?
I think there's generally a lot of dogmatism around funding advice from really kind of both sides of the aisle. So you have some camps that suggest, you raise as much as possible, raise as much capital as possible. And then there's a whole other camp that says, no, you've got to bootstrap for as long as possible. And I actually think both of those kind of mantras I disagree with both. And I think the actual kind of what's right for the individual and for the company is more often than not somewhere in between those things.
What's a popular belief in the edtech world that you disagree with?
I think I would challenge the viewpoint that you sometimes hear thrown around that you can either achieve impact in edtech, so as measured by, for example, number of students reached, or kind of learning improvement, learning milestones achieved, or you can build a great business, one that grows, scales, generates revenue, and ultimately becomes a sustainable, profitable enterprise. I really challenge and disagree with the idea that these two things are diametrically opposed.
And finally, my new favorite question to end on, do you have a favorite life motto, either personal or professional, that you find yourself coming back to often?
I'm quite a big New Year's resolution person. So I relish the idea that with the new year, there's a bit of a blank slate and an opportunity to reset, reflect, and establish a new set of goals for the year. So this year, I've actually adopted as my mantra, if you will, a quote from Brene Brown, the American academic. She's author of several books. And she has this fantastic quote that says, choose courage over comfort. So that's my 2024 motto.
I love it. Thank you so much, Lucy. It's been an amazing session hearing about your journey building BridgeU and also all the lessons you've taken from that. And I think this is a really great case study in organizational design because you've really been through it from the very early days of starting a company from scratch up to integrating with a company like Kaplan and suddenly being part of a massive organization. So a lot of learnings and insights for founders. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing those.
Thank you so much, Zara.
Thanks for listening to the Emerge Product Market Fit Academy. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it, follow our channel, and if you're feeling generous, share it with a friend.